This is what happens when you hire charity cases. She can't even remember to smile at customers. That is what Derek Caldwell said 47 minutes before everything changed. The Peachtree Diner in Atlanta smells of burnt coffee and fryer grease, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like insects trapped in their cages. Elena Martinez wipes table 7 for the third time that morning, her movements precise and economical, the kind of efficiency that comes from muscle memory older than most people's military service records. The vinyl booth seat is sticky beneath her cloth, syrup from last night's breakfast rush, probably, and she wipes it without hesitation, without complaint. Her hands are steady despite the old scar tissue running up her left wrist, a jagged map of something she never discusses. She's 42 years old. Invisible. That's how she prefers it. The morning staff meeting happens at 6:30, before the lunch rush, in the cramped office behind the kitchen where the air conditioning doesn't work. Derek Caldwell stands with his arms crossed, his manager's polo shirt pressed sharp enough to cut, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who has never doubted himself because he has never had reason to. His power comes from the district manager's phone line and the owner's nephew, both numbers saved in his contacts. He has been building a file on Elena for 3 weeks. He mentions this explicitly as he points at her across the table. Jessica and Tom and the college kid Marcus listen in a silence that feels like held breath. This is what happens when you hire out of charity, Caldwell says, looking directly at her now. No work ethic. No drive. No understanding of customer service fundamentals. He flips through a small notebook, he actually takes notes, and reads items like a prosecutor. Refused to suggest the cheesecake special to table 9. Gave away a free coffee to the vagrant at booth 3. Again. He pauses, letting the word hang. Again. As though Elena has committed a pattern of crimes. The homeless veteran, Caldwell continues, his tone suggesting the man might as well be wearing a sign, liability. He sits by the window, he orders water, and you give him a coffee. That's inventory loss. That's theft of services. That's exactly what I mean about standards. Elena's jaw clenches. Just once. A single involuntary muscle contraction that lasts perhaps 2 seconds. Then her face goes blank again, the kind of neutral expression that comes from decades of not showing what you're thinking in rooms where showing anything could be dangerous. She doesn't speak. She doesn't defend herself. She simply nods, and when Caldwell dismisses them, let's talk about what professional service actually looks like, people, she stands and walks back into the dining room to resume her work. The kitchen door swings shut behind her with a hydraulic hiss. She can hear Caldwell still talking, his voice muffled now, something about liability nightmares and the importance of documentation. Jessica brushes past her on the way to her section, and their eyes meet for exactly half a second. There is something like apology in Jessica's glance. Elena doesn't acknowledge it. She moves to her station, where the salt shakers sit in a plastic bin waiting to be refilled. The shakers are old, their glass clouded from years of humidity and dish machine cycles. Some of them have cracks. She begins filling them systematically, her hands moving with the same steady precision she brought to table 7's sticky vinyl. The salt shaker in her hands is warm from the afternoon sun that slants through the front window. She fills it carefully, using a small funnel, watching the white crystals cascade down. In Baghdad, 22 years ago, she had filled 4 bags with the same careful attention, working by battery-powered light in a building that wasn't supposed to have anyone alive inside it anymore. She had worked for 11 hours straight because the boy wouldn't stop crying and she wouldn't leave him until he did. That boy is 40 years old now, probably. He has a life Elena will never know. She didn't save his life expecting a thank you. She didn't save it expecting anything at all. She saved it because that's what her hands knew how to do. The salt shaker is full. She moves to the next one. Through the window, she can see the homeless veteran, his name is William, though Caldwell doesn't use it, sitting at booth 3 with a cup of water in front of him. He's wearing the same jacket he wore yesterday, a blue windbreaker that might once have been navy. His hands shake slightly as he lifts the water glass. She gave him a coffee yesterday because he reminded her of someone. Maybe herself. maybe just the particular exhaustion of a man who has nowhere else to be. Caldwell emerges from the kitchen, moving past her toward his office without speaking. He doesn't need to speak. His presence is enough, the particular quality of his attention like weight pressing down. Elena doesn't look up from the salt shaker. She simply continues filling them, one after another, a task that requires no thought because it requires no thought. She knows her value isn't in what Caldwell sees. She knows it in the scar tissue mapped across her left wrist and the particular steadiness of her hands and the way her breathing never elevates even when she's angry. In her locker, beneath her spare black apron, sits a pair of boots. They're made of tan desert leather, scuffed and worn, the laces tied in a way that only someone with military training would recognize. The soles are worn down unevenly because of how she walks, a weight distribution that comes from years of carrying 70 pounds of gear across terrain that wasn't meant for walking. She hasn't worn those boots in 22 years. She hasn't even touched them, really, just moved them from locker to locker, from city to city, from one life to the next. They're all she allows herself from before. Everything else, the photographs, the commendations, the unit patch from the 75th Rangers, the dog tags with her real name engraved on them, all of that is stored in a safety deposit box in a bank in Richmond that she hasn't visited since 2008. These boots are different. These boots stay with her. The lunch rush begins at 11:30. Tables fill in rapid succession. The Peachtree Diner fills with the sound of clattering silverware and voices layering over each other, the ventilation system struggling to move the smell of burgers and frying oil out of the space. Elena moves between tables with the careful efficiency of someone who knows exactly where every obstacle is. She pours coffee with her right hand while her left hand balances the pot, never spilling. She takes orders without writing them down because she doesn't need to. She retrieves plates from the kitchen window with the kind of timing that suggests she can measure seconds in her head. Caldwell watches from his office window. She knows he's watching. She can feel the particular weight of his attention the way she learned to feel proximity threats in Baghdad when the streets were tight and the rooftops were unpredictable. She doesn't change her behavior because of it. That would give him information. Instead, she simply works, the way she would work if he wasn't there, the way she will work whether he fires her or promotes her. Her face remains blank. Her hands remain steady. Her composure is the one thing in this diner that belongs entirely to her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the email Caldwell sent to the district manager at 3 o'clock, while Elena was on her break in the break room, sitting silently with a cup of coffee that nobody had to give her because she made it herself. The email documented every violation, every moment of non-compliance, every instance of liability exposure. He was building a case. He had no idea that the woman he was documenting had once made life-and-death decisions while mortar rounds shook the walls around her. He had no idea that her hands had held together people who were falling apart in every possible way. He had no idea that she was classified so far above his security clearance that if he knew the truth about her, his phone would ring and men in dark suits would arrive and some conversations would never happen again. Elena sits in the break room at a plastic table with her coffee growing cold. There is a small window that looks out onto the parking lot. The afternoon sun is bright and relentless. She thinks about the boots in her locker. She thinks about William at booth 3. She thinks about Caldwell's voice saying a charity case as though charity were an insult. Then she finishes her coffee, sets the cup in the sink, and returns to work, her jaw still clenched but her face still blank, still invisible, still waiting. The lunch rush was building when Caldwell positioned himself near the kitchen expo line, arms crossed, his posture the kind that made the air pressure change. He was watching Elena with the intensity of a predator sizing up prey, his eyes tracking every table she worked, every interaction, every moment she wasn't smiling hard enough or upselling aggressively enough. At 11:41 a.m., he made his move. Floor meeting. Now. Dining area. His voice carried across the restaurant like a command, and the other servers exchanged glances. This wasn't normal. Caldwell rarely called impromptu gatherings during service. Elena was refilling water glasses at table 4 when she heard it. She set down the pitcher, her jaw already tightening, and walked toward the dining room where Derek Caldwell stood in the center of the floor like he owned every square inch. The other servers gathered: Tom, Jessica, Sharon, Marcus from the kitchen. Customers kept eating, but the noise level dropped. People always sensed when something was about to happen. Caldwell began to circle Elena slowly, and she stood motionless, hands at her sides, her face a blank slate that had perfected itself over 2 decades in operating theaters where showing emotion got people killed. "This," Caldwell said, gesturing at her like she was exhibits in his personal museum of failure, "is your textbook example of everything wrong with our service standards. Charity Case here thinks compassion pays the bills." He used the nickname deliberately, letting it hang in the air like cigarette smoke. "Yesterday she gave away 3 coffees. 3. Do you understand what that costs me? Do you?" Elena didn't blink. She didn't move. Her jaw clenched once, hard, and then released. That was all. That was everything she allowed herself to show. Jessica stared at her shoes. Tom looked at his hands. Sharon smirked, the way people do when they're relieved the spotlight isn't on them. Caldwell continued his slow orbit around Elena, his voice rising slightly, warming to the performance of it. "Charity Case thinks she's saving lives," he said, and there was something in his voice now, contempt mixed with something uglier, something that looked like he was testing her to see if she'd finally break, finally cry, finally give him the reaction he was hunting for. Next she'll be running the medical board from her coffee station. The only thing she's qualified to do is disappear. Elena's eyes remained forward, her breathing steady. Calm. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world could offer. The kind of calm that had held steady while mortar rounds shook the walls of a field hospital in Baghdad. Her hands didn't tremble. Her voice didn't crack. She gave him nothing. After 2 minutes that felt like 20, Caldwell dismissed them with a wave, clearly disappointed that she hadn't provided the entertainment he'd hoped for. The servers scattered back to their tables. Elena returned to her station and began polishing silverware, her movements precise and mechanical, as if the humiliation had been delivered to someone else entirely. At 1:15 p.m., during her break, Elena headed to the back hallway where the vending machine hummed its monotonous song. She needed coffee, not because she wanted it, but because standing still for even 5 minutes would give her time to think, and thinking was something she couldn't afford. Her hand was reaching for the coins when Caldwell appeared with Sharon, his voice pitched loud enough for the kitchen staff to overhear. "You know what I love?" Caldwell said, loud and theatrical, "when Charity Case thinks she's a doctor. Did you see her with that old homeless guy the other day? Pouring his coffee like she was performing surgery. Next she'll be diagnosing the meatloaf, prescribing it for hypertension." Sharon laughed, a sharp, nervous sound that echoed off the tile. "Maybe she learned medicine from a fortune cookie." Elena inserted coins into the machine. The mechanical whir of the coffee dispensing was the only sound that mattered to her. Her hands were steady as surgical steel. She didn't turn around. She didn't acknowledge him. The coffee cup fell into the slot with a soft clink, and she retrieved it, the paper sleeve warm between her palms, and walked past both of them without making eye contact, her pace exactly the same as it had been before they started speaking. "That's what I thought, Charity Case," Caldwell called after her, satisfaction dripping from every word because he thought her silence was surrender. It wasn't. It was restraint. There was a difference, and the difference was measured in decades of discipline, in decisions made under circumstances that would break most people, in a woman who had learned long ago that the most dangerous warriors were the ones who didn't need to prove it. The afternoon stretched into the thick part of service. Tables turned over. Orders came and went. Caldwell had positioned himself near the host stand, still watching, still waiting for a moment to exploit. At 2:02 p.m., the homeless veteran came in, the same man who came twice a week, who ordered water and sometimes a piece of pie, who Elena treated with the kind of dignity that made Caldwell's skin crawl because it meant she wasn't following his script. He sat at his usual window booth. Elena brought him coffee without being asked, no charge, just poured it from the station pot into a clean cup and set it in front of him with a small nod. The veteran smiled, the kind of smile that comes from being seen as human instead of invisible. "Thank you, miss," he said quietly. Caldwell was there before the coffee had settled. "That's it," he said, his voice low but carrying the kind of controlled anger that's more frightening than shouting. "One more free item, and I call security to escort you out. Do you understand me? Out of this restaurant. Gone." The dining room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming their electric song. Every eye in the place was on this corner of the restaurant now. The veteran stared at his coffee, embarrassed. Caldwell's eyes were on Elena, hunting for something, a flinch, a flash of anger, proof that he could get under her skin if he just kept pressing. Elena met his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Her eyes were the color of a stormy Atlantic at dawn, not angry, not upset, just empty of the performance everyone else was running. She didn't say a word. She turned, coffee pot still in hand, and walked back to her station with the same measured pace she'd used to walk through 1,000 other moments when the world was falling apart around her. She began refilling salt shakers at table 8, her hands moving with precision, her focus absolute. Caldwell lingered, smile spreading across his face like he'd won something. "That's what I thought, charity case," he repeated, as if repetition would make it true. As if the quiet person standing there refilling salt shakers was actually broken, actually defeated, actually just a server with nothing else to offer the world. He had no idea who he was standing next to. That was the thing that would destroy him later. The lunch rush pressed forward. Tables 8 through 13 filled with the afternoon crowd, business people in blazers, couples on dates, a man in a grey Henley and jeans who sat alone at table 12 with a cup of coffee and a burger. He'd ordered light, barely touched anything, just sat staring out the window with the kind of 1,000-yard stare that Elena recognized immediately because she saw it in the mirror every morning. Military bearing in civilian clothes. The kind of posture that came from a life spent carrying weight that civilians would never understand. It was 3:13 p.m. when the man suddenly stood, one hand pressed hard against his chest, the other gripping the edge of the table like it was the only solid thing left in the world. His face went white. His lips turned blue, actually blue, not metaphorically, the color of someone whose oxygen was draining like water from a cracked vessel. He tried to speak. Nothing came out. His eyes went wide, confused, terrified, and then he collapsed backward into the booth with a sound like something breaking inside. A woman at table 9 screamed. A man at table 4 stood up. Servers froze in place, their trays held suspended in space like they'd been paused mid-scene. Caldwell emerged from his office, saw the commotion, started moving toward it with the expression of someone calculating liability and lost revenue instead of a human being in crisis. Elena was already moving. Not running. Moving. There was a difference. Her body remembered things her mind had tried to bury. 20 years ago, she'd held a 7-year-old boy's ribs apart while mortars shook the walls. She'd made decisions in seconds that changed lives forever. She'd performed emergency medicine while blood dripped onto sand and the sound of gunfire echoed like thunder. She reached table 12 in 4 seconds. Her fingers went to the man's neck, carotid pulse muffled, distended jugular veins, the clinical picture of cardiac tamponade forming in her mind like a diagnosis written in blood. Fluid was crushing his heart. Pericardial fluid compressing the chambers. He had maybe 3 minutes before cardiac arrest. She turned to Tom, who was standing frozen with a water pitcher. "Call 911, she said. Her voice was different now, not the deferential murmur of the server, but command sharp, the voice of someone used to being obeyed in emergencies. "Tell them cardiac tamponade. Male, late 20s. We need emergency transport now." Tom's mouth opened. No sound came out. "Tell them," Elena repeated, her eyes never leaving the man's face, her hands already scanning the table for what she needed. "Now." Tom moved. He ran to the phone behind the counter. Customers were pulling out their phones, filming or calling or just panicking the way people do when they realize the world is fragile and they're sitting inside a restaurant eating lunch when someone dies. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Derek Caldwell was walking toward her with his phone already in his hand, his face reddening, his mouth opening to say something about unauthorized medical procedures and liability, when Elena looked up at him with eyes that had seen things he couldn't imagine, and he finally, understood that he'd been standing next to a predator the whole time, and the predator had just been waiting for permission to move. The collapse came at 3:24 p.m. Colonel James Mitchell was mid-sip of iced tea when his hand trembled. The glass fell. His lips turned blue, not gradually, not in the way people describe in movies, but sudden, violent, the color draining from his face like someone had pulled a plug. He clawed at his chest, his back arching off the chair at table 12, his mouth opening in a silent gasp that finally became a sound, a wheeze, thin and desperate, the sound of a drowning man breathing air. Around him, the lunch crowd fractured. A woman at the adjacent booth screamed. A server, Marcus from day's shift, froze mid-stride, his tray still level in his hands as if the world had paused and forgotten to tell him to move. Someone yelled for a manager. Someone else was already dialing 911, their voice high and panicked. "We have a medical emergency, Peachtree Diner, a man is collapse." Elena was already moving. She didn't run. Running was for panic, and panic was for people who hadn't spent 11 years in field hospitals where hesitation killed. She walked from table 8 to table 12 in 4 strides, her movements fluid, economical, the kind of motion that came from muscle memory older than her civilian identity. One of the other servers reached toward Mitchell, a reflexive gesture, hands outstretched but useless. Elena moved past him without acknowledging it, her eyes already reading what she saw, the cyanosis spreading from his lips, the jugular veins distended like ropes, the accessory muscles of his neck working overtime to pull breath into lungs that had no room to expand. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid around the heart, crushing it, suffocating the chambers from the outside in. "Get me a steak knife and a candle," Elena said quietly to the server frozen beside her. "What?" The server's name was Jessica. She'd been at the diner for 2 weeks. "Steak knife. Candle." From table 6. Elena was already pulling Mitchell flat onto the floor, his body going limp with a kind of shock that stripped away dignity and left only biology. She ran her fingers across his ribs, finding the landmarks, the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The trembling was only in the watching crowd, never in the hands that had done this before in a basement in Baghdad while mortar rounds made the concrete weep dust. Jessica thrust a steak knife into her hand. The candle came a second later, white, vanilla-scented, from the centerpiece of table 6 where 2 businessmen sat frozen, their eyes locked on the scene unfolding 15 feet away. Elena held the knife blade over the flame. The metal darkened, then glowed, the heat turning the tip black as carbon built up. She counted the seconds, 3, 4, 5, then pulled it back and wiped the blade on Mitchell's shirt. The smell of burning metal and cloth hung in the air, acrid, the kind of smell that carries memory, sand and diesel exhaust and the chemical stink of war-torn medicine. "What the hell are you doing?" Derek Caldwell's voice carved through the moment like a dull blade. He was pushing through the gathered crowd, his restaurant manager polo already sweat-darkened at the collar, his phone already in his free hand. "Step away from him." Elena didn't step away. She didn't acknowledge him. She positioned Mitchell with one hand on his chest, palpating, finding the exact spot where the needle needed to go. The pen, a cheap ballpoint from the hostess stand, was already in her other hand. She cracked the plastic casing with her thumbnail, removed the ink cartridge with her teeth, and extracted the hollow tube. It was maybe 2 inches long. It was everything. "I'm calling the police," Caldwell said. His voice had climbed an octave. "You're not authorized to touch this man. You're not a doctor. You can't just." Elena made the incision. The blade went between Mitchell's ribs with a soft resistance, the intercostal muscles parting like they'd been expecting her. She'd done this in a basement in Baghdad while a 7-year-old boy lay buried in concrete, while his mother's voice had stopped screaming because she was dead, while every second of hesitation was a second his brain went without oxygen. She'd done it with sweat pouring down her face and shell casings littering the floor. She could do it in a restaurant in Atlanta while Derek Caldwell watched from 3 feet away, his phone trembling in his hand. Dark fluid, almost black, thick with old blood, began to drain the moment she inserted the pen tube. Mitchell gasped. His entire body convulsed, not in pain but in sudden relief, the kind of relief that comes when the weight crushing your heart finally lifts. His lips pinkened. His breathing deepened. Within 90 seconds, his color was human again. Within 2 minutes, consciousness flickered back into his eyes. The room had gone dead silent. You could hear the fluorescent lights humming in the ceiling, a sound most people never noticed until there was nothing else. You could hear the ice shifting in the drink station behind the kitchen pass. You could hear someone's phone buzzing, ignored, in a pocket somewhere in the crowd. Caldwell stood frozen, his phone halfway to his ear, the police dispatcher's voice tinny and small. "Hello? Sir? What's the nature of the emergency?" The paramedics arrived 6 minutes later, their voices filling the void. "What do we have, and who initiated treatment, and what's her credentials?" They were professionals, their eyes already taking inventory of the scene, the sterile knife, the pen tube, the precision of the incision, the steady hand that had made it. Elena wiped her hands on a bar towel while they loaded Mitchell onto the stretcher. One of the paramedics, a man with sergeant stripes and the bearing of someone used to trusting his gut, leaned close to her as they wheeled past. "You military?" he asked. Elena shook her head. "Just a server." But they both knew it was a lie. The kind of lie that was necessary because the truth couldn't fit inside a restaurant where people had been discussing specials and checking their emails 3 minutes ago. The ambulance left. The crowd dispersed slowly, the spell breaking, conversations resuming in hushed tones. A couple near the window kept staring at table 12. The white tablecloth was streaked with blood. Water glasses lay on their sides, the water spreading in dark patterns across the fabric. A piece of the pen casing lay on the floor. Derek Caldwell stood in the center of it all, his face the color of rust. His hands were shaking, not with relief or awe, but with something hotter and uglier. His eyes moved from the mess to Elena to the empty chair where Mitchell had collapsed. "Look at this mess," he said quietly. His voice had dropped below her hearing range, meant for himself. "My dining room. My liability." Sharon, one of the other servers, already had her phone out. The camera flash caught the blood on the tablecloth, the overturned glasses, Elena standing perfectly still in the middle of the wreckage she'd created to save a man's life. Sharon was already typing, her thumbs moving fast, the story spreading before the paramedics had even made it to the parking lot. Caldwell turned to Elena. His jaw was working like he was chewing something bitter. "Go home," he said. "We'll discuss this tomorrow." Elena nodded once. She walked to the back, hung her apron on its hook, and collected her things from her locker. The pair of worn combat boots was still there, hidden beneath her spare apron, the leather cracked and faded from a different world. She didn't touch them. Not yet. She simply closed the locker door and walked out through the kitchen, past the line cooks who'd stopped working to stare, past the prep station, and into the parking lot where the ambulance was already rolling toward the hospital, its lights pulsing red and white against the Atlanta afternoon. She sat in her car for exactly 4 minutes before her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer. "Is this Elena Martinez?" A man's voice, clipped and precise, the kind of voice that had given orders for a very long time. "Yes. This is Colonel James Mitchell. The gentleman from table 12. I'm with emergency services now. They tell me I'm stable because of you." A pause. "I need to know who you are, because I recognize the work. That procedure. The precision. The control." Another pause, longer this time. "I've only ever seen one person perform an emergency pericardiocentesis with that kind of composure." Elena didn't speak. "That was in Baghdad," Mitchell continued. 20 years ago. Field hospital. I was 7 years old. You spent 11 hours digging me out of a collapsed building, and you wouldn't leave until I was breathing on my own." His voice cracked slightly. My name wasn't James Mitchell then. But I remember your face. I remember your voice telling me I was going to live. The phone felt very heavy in Elena's hand. What happened next changed everything. Caldwell emerged from his office as the ambulance pulled away, his face the color of raw liver. The overturned water glasses. The blood on the white tablecloth. The spreading stain like an accusation. He stood frozen for 3 seconds, watching the lunch crowd return to their conversations with the tentative energy of people who'd just witnessed something they didn't have words for. Elena was already moving, already clearing the adjacent tables, her movements precise and economical. She didn't acknowledge his stare. She never did. His jaw clenched. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Then something shifted behind his eyes, in not anger, but calculation. The kind of look a predator gets when it realizes it's been cornered and begins mapping escape routes. He turned and walked back to his office without a word. That evening, Derek Caldwell sat at his desk with his phone pressed to his ear and a legal pad filling with notes. The district manager's voice came through crisp and corporate, unauthorized medical procedures on restaurant premises. Derek, do you understand the liability exposure? Caldwell had already prepared. He'd photographed the table. He'd documented witness statements from 3 servers. He'd researched Georgia Health Code Section 3 April, 43, subsection C, which prohibited non-licensed medical personnel from administering invasive care in food service establishments. He'd built the case methodically, the way a prosecutor builds a felony charge. She performed emergency surgery with a steak knife, Caldwell said into the phone. A pen. In front of 40 customers. If that man had sued us, the settlement would have bankrupted the franchise. He paused, letting the financial threat hang in the air like smoke. I'm protecting the business. The district manager didn't argue. Corporations protect corporations. Caldwell hung up and immediately dialed another number, the owner's nephew, Marcus Sterling, who sat on the state restaurant licensing board. Sterling answered on the 3rd ring, the sound of golf course ambient noise in the background. We have a situation, Caldwell began, and he explained it again. The unauthorized procedure. The liability. The precedent this set. The danger of one rogue employee thinking she could override health code whenever she felt heroic. Sterling listened with the attention of a man who'd spent 20 years shutting down problematic restaurants for far less. By the time Caldwell finished, Sterling was already pulling up records. I'll make some calls, Sterling said. But if she has legitimate medical credentials, our hands are limited. Caldwell smiled. He'd already checked. Elena Martinez had no nursing license on file. No paramedic certification. No emergency medical technician credentials. She was technically just a server who'd performed invasive cardiac surgery. On his premises. Without authorization. Over the next 2 days, Caldwell's documentation grew. He called a personal attorney friend who specialized in restaurant liability. He had Sharon, the head server, provide written statements about Elena's pattern of insubordination and recklessness. He photographed the incident site again, labeling each image with dates and times. By day 2, he had a file thick enough to present to the licensing board. By day 3, he had emails from Sterling confirming that the state was investigating whether Elena had violated multiple health codes. What Caldwell didn't know was that he was building a case against someone who officially didn't exist. What he didn't know was that Master Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez had spent 15 years erased from every database, every roster, every official record. Her real name was buried under operational classification so deep that even the Pentagon's standard record searches came back empty. She'd been ordered to disappear in 2008 after a Black Ops extraction in Fallujah went sideways. The order had come from JSOC itself. You will assume a civilian identity. You will not surface. You will not claim your rank. You will not contact active duty personnel. You will not exist. So when the licensing board called asking for her nursing credentials, Elena had nothing to show. No diploma. No state license. No proof of training or certification. Just the truth, that she'd trained 1,000 field medics, that she'd run a hospital that saved more lives than most civilian trauma centers saved in a year, that she'd held a 7-year-old boy's hand while she performed emergency surgery in the dark with incoming fire shaking the building. But truth wasn't a credential. Truth was classified. Elena received a call from Caldwell on a Tuesday evening. His voice was professional, almost warm. "Elena, I need you to take a few days off. We're doing some staff restructuring. I'll mail your final check." "Understood," Elena said, and hung up before he could add conditions. She knew what was happening. She'd seen men like Caldwell before, not in combat, but in the smaller wars of peacetime. Men who'd been cornered by the presence of someone competent. Men who couldn't tolerate being reminded that they were ordinary. The only difference here was that Caldwell had institutional power. He had the licensing board. He had corporate support. He had the ability to make sure that Elena Martinez never worked in food service in Atlanta again. What he didn't have was any idea what he was actually contending with. On day 3, Elena walked back into the Peachtree Diner at 2:15 in the afternoon, during the quiet window between lunch and dinner rush. The place was nearly empty. Caldwell emerged from his office with her server uniform folded in a plastic bag and her final check in an envelope. He handed both to her without meeting her eyes, the posture of a man who'd convinced himself that maintaining professional distance was the same as maintaining dignity. Elena took the uniform and walked to the back hallway where the laundry service was located. She removed the black apron from the plastic bag. The fabric was still slightly stiff from the bleach they used. She unfolded it carefully, smoothing the wrinkles with the same methodical attention she'd once used preparing surgical instruments. Then she folded it again. And again. Each fold precise, each crease sharp enough to cut. The repetition was muscle memory from 20 years of field operations, the meditation of preparation, the ritual of discipline. When she was finished, the apron was a perfect square no larger than a paperback book. From his office window, Caldwell watched. He saw her emerge from the back hallway, saw her close her locker, saw her pick up the small cardboard box containing her personal items. The combat boots were still inside. She hadn't opened the locker since the incident. She would get them later, she'd decided. Let them sit there a little longer. Let them remain hidden just a few more days. Caldwell returned to his desk and opened a new document on his computer. The subject line read, "Incident Report, Elena Martinez, Unauthorized Medical Procedure." He began typing methodically, documenting everything he'd documented before but with the formal tone of a man creating permanent record. He included the witness statements. He included the photographs. He included the reference to Health Code 43-4-3C. He included his own assessment. This employee demonstrated reckless disregard for food service regulations and posed an ongoing risk to customer safety through unauthorized practice of medicine. He made sure to use the phrase pattern of insubordination at least 3 times. He made sure to emphasize that no medical credentials could be verified. He made sure to include language about liability prevention and protecting future establishments from similar incidents. He sent the document to Sterling. Sterling forwarded it to the licensing board with his own professional recommendation. This establishment acted appropriately in terminating this employee. I recommend flagging her name statewide to prevent employment in any food service capacity. By the time Caldwell hit send, Elena was already in her car, driving away from the Peachtree Diner for what she thought might be the last time. The check Caldwell had given her was for $347.82, 3 days of unpaid work plus her standard hourly rate for the hours she'd already completed. She didn't look at it. She placed it on the passenger seat and focused on the road ahead. She had no idea what was about to happen. She had no idea that her son Marcus had spent the last 3 days on the phone with Colonel James Mitchell. She had no idea that Colonel Mitchell had spent those same 3 days making calls, first to his commanding officer at Fort Moore, then to JSOC headquarters, then to contacts in Washington. She had no idea that somewhere in a classified filing system, the order to erase Master Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez was being rescinded. She had no idea that 75 soldiers in dress uniform were being assembled at that very moment, loading into military vehicles, receiving briefing orders that included a single photograph and 4 words, "Bring her home." The rain started as she drove, hammering the windshield like applause, and Elena pulled over in a parking lot to wait for it to pass. She sat in the silence of her car, hands on the steering wheel, breathing in through her nose and out through her mouth, the same breathing technique she'd taught to frightened young medics under fire in Ramadi. What she was about to learn would change everything. What was happening in that diner in the next 48 hours would end a career, restore a legend, and remind 75 warriors why they served. But in this moment, Elena Martinez was just a nurse who'd been fired for saving a life. In this moment, she had no idea who she was about to become. The general's boots made no sound on the tile floor, but Derek Caldwell heard them anyway. He stood pressed against his office doorframe, sweat beading at his temples, his manager's badge suddenly feeling like a target on his chest. The general stopped 3 feet away. Behind him, the soldiers stood at perfect parade rest, their dress uniforms creating a wall of navy blue that stretched across the entire dining room. "You are Derek Caldwell?" the general asked. Not a question. A confirmation. Caldwell's mouth went dry. Yes. Sir. You terminated Elena Martinez 3 days ago. She performed an unauthorized medical procedure. I have documentation. Liability exposure. I contacted the district manager, the licensing board. Caldwell's words came fast, defensive, like a man throwing sandbags in front of a rising tide. I was protecting this business. The general didn't blink. Elena Martinez is Master Chief Petty Officer, United States Naval Special Warfare Command. 18 commendations. For classified operations spanning 2 decades. He pulled a folder from his briefcase, a folder so thick it made a sound like a gunshot when it hit the host stand. Her records were declassified 72 hours ago. Per executive order. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Caldwell's face cycled through colors. Red. White. Gray. I didn't know. How was I supposed to? You fired her because she showed compassion to a homeless veteran. The general's voice remained level, which somehow made it more lethal. You documented her violations for giving away coffee. You threatened to call security on a woman who has spent 20 years serving this country in ways you cannot comprehend. Sharon had vanished into the kitchen. Tom, the college kid, stood at attention in the corner. Jessica from the morning shift was crying silently, her hands covering her mouth. The homeless veteran, the one Caldwell had threatened to have removed, sat by the window with tears running down his weathered face. "You're terminated," the general said. "Effective immediately." "You don't have authority here," Caldwell started, but the general raised his phone. The speaker came alive with a man's voice, calm and final. "This is Richard Brennan, owner of Peachtree Restaurant Group. Mr. Caldwell, your termination is approved. Security will collect your keys and escort you from the building. You have 5 minutes." Caldwell's face crumpled. "The district manager approved my documentation. The licensing board nephew recused himself from all related matters as of 20 minutes ago," the general said. "Your documentation has been withdrawn from review. The district manager has been briefed on the full context of Elena's emergency intervention. She called to apologize for not verifying facts before supporting your complaint." Every network Caldwell had pulled was unraveling in real time. His attorney friend. His board contact. His carefully built case against a woman who had committed the only sin of being better than him. A local news crew pushed through the restaurant doors, their camera already rolling. Someone had tipped them off, one of the soldiers, maybe, or someone who understood that the truth deserved witnesses. The camera found Caldwell's face, captured the exact moment his world collapsed. The general raised the manager's badge, the physical credential that had made Caldwell feel important for 3 years, and held it out. "This belongs to someone else now." Elena stood motionless as the general extended it toward her. She didn't reach for it. didn't take it. Just looked at Caldwell with the calm of someone who had already survived worse things than him by orders of magnitude. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward, his chest still wrapped from the trauma, his breathing still slightly labored from 3 days of recovery. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of command, the precision of a man accustomed to being heard. You fired the woman who spent 11 hours digging me out of rubble in Baghdad when I was 7 years old. He paused. Spent 11 hours under fire. Refused to leave until I was breathing. The camera swung to Mitchell. The news anchor's expression shifted, recognition. The soldier they'd come to cover wasn't a random veteran. He was the reason they were here. His words on air would matter. She saved my life twice, Mitchell continued. Once as a child. Once this week. And you punished her for it. Caldwell tried to speak. No words came. He looked at the servers, Jessica, Tom, Maria from the prep station. None of them would meet his eyes. The homeless veteran by the window raised his hand in a salute, the gesture carrying more weight than any words. Caldwell had threatened that man. Had treated him like refuse. But Elena had seen him as human. He backed into his office, grabbed his jacket from the chair, and walked toward the kitchen exit. No one followed. No one called after him. His departure was so complete, so final, that it was as if he had been erased from the space the moment he left. The general turned to Elena. Master Chief, you have your clearance back. Your record has been restored. The Pentagon is waiting for your decision on whether to return to active duty or pursue civilian opportunities. Elena's jaw moved slightly, not quite a nod, more like the settling of something heavy. I have a decision, she said quietly. I'm staying in Atlanta. There's work to do here. The general saluted her. Not the casual salute of a superior to a subordinate, but the formal, full salute of one warrior to another. 75 soldiers followed in unison, and the sound of 75 hands against 75 chests was like the crack of a rifle. 6 months later, Elena sat in her new office at the Atlanta Veterans Affairs Medical Center, running the newly established Green Beret outreach program. Her desk overlooked a parking lot where rain hammered the asphalt like applause. The combat boots she'd hidden for 20 years sat on a shelf behind her, polished to a mirror shine, no longer a secret she had to keep. The shadow box hung on the wall beside a framed unit citation. Beneath it, a plaque read, Master Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez, USN, Ret. Phantom 6. And engraved below, true heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. Marcus visited after school sometimes, helping with intake paperwork, seeing his mother in this new light, not as the fired diner waitress, but as what she had always been. A leader. A protector. A woman whose quiet strength had simply been waiting for the world to finally pay attention. Colonel Mitchell stopped by once a month with coffee, sitting in the waiting room for hours sometimes, just being present. Not because Elena needed saving anymore, but because some bonds, once forged in fire and blood, never truly dissolve. They just transform into something deeper. Across town, Derek Caldwell sat at a folding table outside a Kroger grocery store, selling supplemental insurance policies for $7 an hour. His manager credential from Peachtree Diner sat in a cardboard box in his garage, next to an incident report no one had ever bothered to read. Sharon worked at a different restaurant now, and when he'd called to apologize, she didn't answer. The district manager sent rejection emails. His attorney friend wasn't returning calls. Elena answered the phone when a young sergeant from the 75th Ranger Regiment called seeking help navigating benefits. She listened. She knew the system. She knew the barriers. She knew what it felt like to be invisible. She spent 90 minutes on that call, walking him through every form, every appeal, every resource. When they finished, he said thank you. She said you're welcome, and meant it. Before she hung up, she added, you don't have to carry it alone anymore. That's what we're here for. The veteran on the other end of the line was quiet for a moment, then, thank you, Master Chief. Elena didn't correct him. She just got back to work. The phone rang again. Another veteran. Another story. Another person who needed someone who understood that service meant something, that sacrifice meant something, that the quiet strength of a woman pushing a mop or wearing scrubs could be the most powerful force in the room. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your story, if you've ever had to prove your worth by your actions rather than your words, you know exactly what Elena Martinez felt in that moment. She wasn't seeking recognition anymore. Recognition had finally caught up to her. Now she was just doing what she'd always done, saving people who needed saving. Like, subscribe, and comment below. Have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? What changed your mind?